It was a quiet, suffocating kind of night in a forgotten neighborhood just outside a small American town. The kind of place where houses stood too far apart and streetlights flickered like they were struggling to stay alive. And as Ethan Carter parked his car in front of the old, rotting house that belonged to Jake Morrison's late uncle, he felt something deep in his chest tighten without reason, like a warning that his body understood but his mind ignored. And when Jake stepped out of the car, laughing, tossing the keys in the air, and joking about finally having a perfect horror content location, the uneasiness only grew stronger, while Olivia Reed followed behind them, wrapping her jacket tightly around herself, glancing at the dark windows of the house that reflected nothing back, not even the faint glow of the streetlight behind them, and she muttered quietly that something about the place didn't feel right. But Jake brushed it off, saying every creepy house feels like that at night, and that was exactly why it was perfect. And as he unlocked the door, it opened with a slow, dragging creak that echoed far too deeply into the house, like the sound was traveling through something hollow and endless. And the moment they stepped inside, the air changed, colder than outside, still and heavy like it hadn't moved in years, carrying a faint smell of damp wood and something older, something rotten that didn't belong to just a house. And Ethan immediately noticed how quiet it was, not normal quiet, but the kind where even their breathing sounded too loud, as if the silence itself was listening. And Jake switched on the lights, but they flickered before settling, casting long, unnatural shadows that seemed to stretch further than they should, and Olivia nervously joked that the place already felt haunted, but no one laughed properly this time, and they moved deeper inside, their footsteps creaking loudly against the wooden floor as they explored room after room filled with old furniture, dusty pictures, and personal belongings left behind like someone had disappeared suddenly without taking anything. And Ethan paused at one of the pictures, noticing that the faces of the people in it were scratched out violently, not aged or faded, but deliberately destroyed. And when he pointed it out, Jake frowned and said his uncle was always weird, but even he sounded unsure now, and Olivia suggested they just stay in the living room and not wander too much, but Jake insisted on showing them the whole place, trying to keep the mood light even as his voice began to lose confidence. And as they walked down a narrow hallway, Ethan suddenly stopped, his body going stiff as he raised his hand slightly, signaling them to be quiet. And when Jake asked what was wrong, Ethan whispered that he heard something, a faint sound like voices coming from somewhere deeper in the house. And Jake rolled his eyes at first, saying it was probably the wind or pipes. But then Olivia heard it too, a soft whisper, barely audible but real, like multiple voices speaking over each other, and the three of them stood there in silence, listening as the whispers grew slightly louder, enough to make out something that felt almost like words but not quite, and slowly, almost without realizing, they began following the sound, moving further down the hallway until they reached a door. At the very end, that was slightly open, even though none of them remembered seeing it before, and the whispering was definitely coming from inside, and Olivia immediately said they shouldn't open it, her voice shaking now, but Jake forced a laugh and said this was exactly the kind of thing people come for. And before either of them could stop him, he pushed the door open, and the moment it creaked wider, the whispering stopped instantly, cutting off so suddenly it made their ears ring in the silence that followed. And inside the room was something none of them expected. It wasn't just another storage space or bedroom. It felt different, wrong. The walls darker, the air colder, and in the center of the room was an old wooden desk covered in thick dust except for one spot that looked recently disturbed. And sitting there was a large black book, its surface dull and worn but untouched by dust, like it had been placed there recently or protected somehow. And Ethan felt an immediate pull toward it, something deep and unnatural that made his heart beat faster as he stepped closer, ignoring Olivia's warning to stay back. And as he reached out and touched the cover, a freezing sensation shot through his hands so violently it made him gasp, but instead of pulling away completely, he leaned closer, staring at the strange symbols carved into the book. Symbols that didn't make sense but felt wrong just to look at. And beneath them were scratched words that looked like they had been carved in desperation. Do not open. And Olivia said they needed to leave right now, that this wasn't normal. But Jake stepped beside Ethan, forcing a grin and saying it was probably some old horror prop or journal his uncle left behind. And Ethan didn't respond because something inside him was already deciding, already moving without his permission. And before anyone could stop him, he slowly opened the book, and the second it did, the entire house reacted like something had just been triggered. The lights flickered violently. A loud bang echoed from somewhere upstairs, and the door behind them slammed shut with a force that made Olivia scream. And the air turned icy cold as the pages of the book began flipping on their own, faster and faster, as if something invisible was searching through them. And the whispering returned, louder now, surrounding them from every direction. And then suddenly the pages stopped on one, just one, and all three of them leaned despite their fear. And on that page was a crude drawing of three figures standing in a room that looked exactly like the one they were in. And behind those figures was a tall, unnatural shape, its body stretched and distorted, with no face, just a blank darkness where its features should have been. And as they stared, frozen in place, new words began forming beneath the drawing, appearing slowly like ink, bleeding through the page. "It sees you now." And the moment the last word finished, something shifted in the room behind them, a soft, slow movement that didn't belong to any of them. And Olivia whispered in a trembling voice not to turn around, but Jake already had, and what he saw made the color drain completely from his face as he stumbled backward, his voice breaking into a terrified scream. And Ethan and Olivia turned despite themselves, and standing in the corner of the room where there had been nothing before was a tall, impossibly thin figure, its limbs too long, bending at angles that made no sense, its head tilted slightly as if observing them. And though it had no eyes, no face, they all felt it staring directly into them. And for a moment none of them could move, as if their bodies had forgotten how, until the thing suddenly shifted forward without walking, gliding closer in a way that broke reality itself. And that was when the paralysis broke and they ran, crashing into each other as they rushed for the door, pulling it open and stumbling into the hallway as the whispering exploded around them, louder and clearer now, repeating something over and over in voices that sounded almost human, but not quite. And as they ran, Ethan realized with growing horror that the hallway seemed longer than before, stretching further than it should, and the shadows along the walls moved slightly as they passed, like something inside them was trying to reach out. And behind them, they could feel it following, not fast, not rushing, but always there, always close enough to catch them if they slowed down. And when they reached the living room, Jake tried the front door, but it wouldn't open, no matter how hard he pulled, and Olivia started crying, saying they were trapped, that this wasn't real. But Ethan turned back toward the hallway and saw something that made his blood run cold, because at the far end, barely visible in the darkness, that same tall figure stood motionless, watching them. And the whispering stopped suddenly, replaced by a single voice, clear and calm inside Ethan's head, and it said only one thing: you should not have opened it. The moment that voice echoed inside Ethan's head, calm and certain, saying you should not have opened it, something inside him broke, not completely, but enough to realize that whatever they had just unleashed was no longer just inside that book or that room. It was everywhere in the house, watching, thinking, waiting, and before he could even react, the lights in the living room flickered violently and then went out completely, plunging them into a darkness so thick it felt almost solid. And Olivia immediately grabbed onto Ethan's arm, her fingers trembling as she whispered that something was breathing near them, something that wasn't one of them. And Jake cursed loudly, fumbling for his phone flashlight, but when it turned on, the weak beam of light only made things worse, because the room didn't look the same anymore. The walls seemed darker, stretched, like the space itself had changed. And the furniture was no longer where it had been moments ago, as if the house was rearranging itself slowly around them, trapping them deeper inside. And then came the sound, a slow, dragging noise from the hallway, like something heavy being pulled across the wooden floor, inch by inch, getting closer and closer and closer. And with each scrape, the whispering returned, not chaotic this time, but synchronized, repeating the same words again and again in low, overlapping voices. One must stay. One must stay, one must stay, and Olivia covered her ears, shaking her head as tears streamed down her face. But it didn't help because the voices weren't just outside, they were inside their heads now, crawling through their thoughts. And Jake shouted that they needed to get out, that they had to break a window or something, and he ran toward the nearest one, but when he pulled the curtain aside, he froze, his entire body going rigid, and Ethan stepped closer, his heart pounding as he looked outside, only to feel his stomach drop completely, because there was no outside anymore, no street, no car, no neighborhood, just darkness, endless black stretching in every direction like the house was no longer connected to the real world. And Jake whispered in disbelief that this wasn't possible, that they were still inside, but the window suddenly cracked loudly, a sharp fracture spreading across the glass from the inside, and before any of them could move, something slammed against it from the other side, not breaking through, just hitting. It once with enough force to make the entire wall shake, and Olivia screamed, stumbling backward, and that was when the dragging sound stopped completely, replaced by silence, so sudden it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. And slowly, very slowly, Ethan turned his head toward the hallway, and at first he saw nothing, just darkness, but then it moved, a shape separating itself from the shadows, taller now, closer than before, its body twisting unnaturally as it leaned slightly into the room. And for the first time, they noticed something new about it, something far worse than its size or shape. Its skin, if it could even be called that, wasn't solid. It looked like layers of darkness folding over each other, shifting constantly like something inside it was trying to get out, and faint shapes pressed against its surface from within, like faces screaming silently, trapped inside whatever this thing was. And Jake whispered that they needed to go upstairs, that staying here would get them killed. And before Ethan could argue, the thing suddenly moved again, faster this time, its body stretching forward without stepping, and that was enough to send them running, racing toward the staircase as the whispering exploded once more, louder and more aggressive, filling the entire house with that same command, one must stay. And as they reached the stairs, Ethan felt something brush against his leg, something cold and thin, and when he looked down, he saw a shadow stretching unnaturally from behind him, wrapping briefly around his ankle before snapping back into the darkness. And he nearly fell, but Jake grabbed him, pulling him up the stairs as fast as possible, the wooden steps creaking violently under their weight. And when they reached the top, the hallway there looked completely different from before, longer, narrower, with doors lining both sides that hadn't been there earlier, and each door was slightly open, revealing only darkness inside. And as they stood there trying to catch their breath, the whispering changed again, quieter now, but clearer, forming actual words, choose, 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 and Olivia shook her head, backing away, saying she couldn't do this, she couldn't choose anything. But Jake turned toward Ethan, his face pale and eyes wide with fear, and said they didn't have a choice, that whatever this thing was, it wanted something from them. And before Ethan could respond, one of the doors down the hallway creaked open wider on its own, and from inside came a sound that made Olivia freeze completely. It was Jake's voice, calling for help, desperate and panicked, even though Jake was standing right beside them, and all three of them stared at each other in horror as the voice repeated again, louder this time, begging them to come inside. And Jake whispered that it was trying to trick them, that they shouldn't listen. But then another door opened slowly, and this time the voice that came from inside was Olivia's, crying and begging for Ethan to help her. And Olivia covered her mouth, shaking her head violently as she said that wasn't her, that she never said that. And then a third door creaked open, and from inside came Ethan's own voice, calling out in fear, telling them to hurry, to come before got him. And Ethan felt his heart nearly stop as he realized what was happening. The thing was learning them, copying them, using their voices to pull them apart. And the whispering grew louder again, more insistent, choose, one must stay, and suddenly the doors began slamming shut one by one, echoing down the hallway like gunshots until only one door remained open at the very end. And the air grew colder than ever before, freezing their breath midair as that same tall figure slowly appeared behind them again, blocking the staircase, cutting off their escape, and this time, it was closer than it had ever been. so close they could see the faint outlines of those trapped shapes moving beneath its surface, pressing outward as if begging to be freed. And Jake turned toward Ethan and Olivia, his expression changing, something breaking inside him as he whispered that this was it, that this was what it wanted, and Olivia immediately shook her head, saying no, they would all go together. But Jake's eyes filled with something heavy, something final, and he looked at Ethan for a long moment before saying quietly that he was sorry. And before either of them could react, he shoved them both toward the open door at the end of the hallway and turned back toward the thing, screaming at it, trying to draw its attention, and Ethan shouted his name, trying to go back, but Olivia grabbed him, pulling him forward as the door began to slam shut behind them. And the last thing Ethan saw before it closed completely was Jake being lifted off the ground by something invisible, his body jerking violently as the darkness wrapped around him, pulling him inward toward that shifting, living void, and his scream cut off abruptly, replaced by a sickening silence. And then the door slammed shut, trapping Ethan and Olivia in complete darkness once again, with only the echo of Jake's final scream lingering in the air. And deep inside Ethan's mind, the whisper returned one last time, quieter now, almost satisfied. Two may leave. The moment that final whisper settled inside Ethan's mind, two may leave, the darkness around him didn't just feel empty anymore. It felt aware, like the space itself was watching him breathe, counting his fear, and somewhere beside him Olivia was shaking uncontrollably, her hand still gripping his wrist, like it was the only thing keeping her from disappearing into the dark. And for a few seconds neither of them moved because they were afraid that even the smallest sound might invite something closer, something worse than what they had already seen. But then a soft creaking came from behind them, the sound of the door they had entered through locking itself without anyone touching it, and that small mechanical click felt louder than a gunshot in the silence. And Olivia whispered that they were still inside the house, still trapped. But Ethan didn't answer because he was staring ahead at the only path left, a narrow corridor that stretched into absolute blackness, darker than anything they had seen before, as if the light itself refused to exist there. And slowly they began walking because standing still felt like waiting for death, and every step they took echoed strangely, like the house was repeating their footsteps a half-second later, mocking them. And as they moved deeper, the whispering started again, but this time it wasn't coming from everywhere. It was coming from inside Ethan's head, low and patient, telling him he should remember, that he already knew the truth. And he kept telling himself it was hallucination, fear, stress, anything logical. But then Olivia suddenly stopped walking, grabbing his arm harder, and when Ethan turned toward her, her face was pale as paper, eyes wide and wet, staring not at him but behind him. And when he slowly turned around, he saw Jake, or something that looked like Jake, standing at the far end of the corridor, completely still, head slightly tilted, but wrong in a way that made Ethan's stomach twist, because the figure's outline kept flickering like a bad signal, sometimes solid, sometimes dissolving into darkness. And then it spoke in Jake's voice, but broken, layered, like multiple people speaking through him at once, saying Ethan's name over and over again. And Olivia whispered that it wasn't him, that it couldn't be him, but the figure took a step forward without moving its legs properly, just sliding closer in a way that made reality feel unstable, and the walls around them began to hum softly like something deep inside the house was waking up again, and the whispering grew louder, merging into a single phrase, not all leave, not all leave, not all leave. And suddenly Ethan realized something horrifying. The book hadn't just shown him a monster. It had set a rule, a balance, like something ancient that demanded payment. And Jake wasn't dead in a normal way. He was being held as part of it. And as that thought formed his mind, the figure that looked like Jake twisted, slightly, its head lifting too far, too slowly, until its neck made a sound like stretched wood. And the face finally shifted, not becoming clear, but becoming wrong, as if different faces were trying to surface through it at the same time. And Olivia started crying harder, saying they had to run, but there was nowhere left to run because the corridor behind them was gone now, replaced by a solid wall. And the one in front was stretching endlessly, and then the lights, if they could even be called that, began flickering again, revealing brief flashes of the house they had entered earlier. Except now, it was different in each flash, sometimes burning, sometimes flooded with darkness, sometimes filled with shadow figures standing still in every room, watching. And Ethan suddenly understood they were not in a house anymore. They were inside something that imitated a house, something built to trap attention. And then the figure spoke again. And this time it wasn't just Jake's voice. It was Ethan's too, and Olivia's, and dozens of others layered together, saying the same thing softly, completed. And the moment those words finished, Olivia screamed as the floor beneath them shifted, opening like a mouth, revealing a space below that had no bottom. Only moving darkness with faint shapes twisting inside it, and Ethan grabbed her hand as they both fell, not down in a straight line but sideways. Like gravity had stopped making sense, and as they dropped through that impossible space, Ethan saw flashes of the book again, pages turning, showing scenes that hadn't happened yet. People reading it in other houses, other cities, all ending the same way. And then he saw Jake again, not as a figure, but as something suspended in that darkness, eyes open but empty, mouth moving silently, as if still trying to speak, and Olivia was screaming his name, but her voice was fading, and the whisper returned one final time, no longer angry or commanding, but calm, almost satisfied, saying, "One remains," and Ethan realized with absolute horror that the choice was never about escaping together. It was about deciding who the house would keep aware, and the last thing he saw before everything collapsed into silence was Olivia being pulled upward instead of down, her body disappearing into the corridor they had come from, while Ethan continued falling into the endless dark below, still conscious, still aware, unable to move, unable to blink, and then the darkness around him didn't feel empty anymore. It felt occupied, like millions of unseen eyes had opened at once. And somewhere far away, he could still hear the house creaking as if it had settled again, waiting for the next group to arrive. And as his thoughts slowly broke apart in the endless void, the final realization came not as fear, but as understanding. The book was never the beginning of the story. It was just a part that lets you notice you're already inside it. And the last whisper he ever heard wasn't outside his mind anymore. It was inside it, repeating softly, endlessly, as if teaching him how to forget what he used to be.